is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories all change in Australia. The newly elected Labour leader says he'll shift the country in a new direction on climate policy. Ukraine says its government could not agree to any ceasefire with Russia that involves giving away any of its land. And President Biden promises greater US economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific region as he lands in Japan on the second leg of his Asia tour. Australia's new leader, Anthony Albanese, has vowed to take action on climate change when he becomes Prime Minister on Monday. The Labour leader defeated Conservative Scott Morrison on Saturday, although it remains unclear whether he'll govern with a majority. Global warming was a key concern for voters after 3 years of record-breaking bushfires and floods. This is Australia's first change of government in nearly a decade. Our correspondent Greg Navarro reports.
A visibly elated Anthony Albanese began his victory speech with a pledge to the country.
My Labor team will work every day to bring Australians together, and I will lead a government worthy of the people of Australia. A government as courageous and hard-working and caring as the Australian people are themselves.
Well, that's an outrageous slur.
That pledge followed a grueling and often divisive 6-week campaign. In the end, voters weren't prepared to send the Conservative Liberal National Party coalition, led by Scott Morrison, back to power for a fourth consecutive term.
I've always believed in Australians and their judgment, and I've always been prepared to accept their verdicts. And tonight they have delivered their verdict.
The election became as much about Morrison as it did the issues, throwing a spotlight on his job performance during the country's bushfires, the pandemic, and most recently the deadly floods in New South Wales and Queensland. The race also focused on the Conservative leader's character, which Morrison acknowledged late in the race, admitting he could be a bulldozer in his approach to the job.
To my colleagues tonight who have had to deal with very difficult news and have lost their seats tonight, I as leader take responsibility for the wins and the losses. That is the burden and that is the responsibility of leadership.
Hey, mate, how you doing?
Good. The incoming Prime Minister presented a contrast to Morrison's approach, underscoring that difference when describing the significance of his win.
It says a lot about our great country that the son of a single mum who was a disability pensioner, who grew up in public housing down the road in Camperdown, can stand before you tonight as Australia's Prime Minister.
What remains to be seen is whether Albanese will govern a majority government. Still a few seats in Parliament shy of that goal, with millions of postal votes being counted. What is becoming evident is that voters apparently wanted more action on climate change than what the two major party candidates were offering, electing a higher than expected number of independent and Green Party candidates who campaigned largely on climate change related issues.
And I can promise all Australians this: no matter how you voted today, the government I lead will respect every one of you every day. And I'll seek to get your vote next time.
Anthony Albanese won't have a great deal of time to savour the win. He's scheduled to fly to Japan on Monday to take part in the Quad meeting with leaders from the US, India and Japan, just hours after being sworn in as Australia's 31st Prime Minister. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Poland's president says only Ukraine has the right to decide its future and warned against giving in to Russian President Vladimir Putin's demands. In the first in-person foreign leaders' address to the Ukrainian parliament since the invasion, President Duda called on the international community to demand that Russia completely withdraw from Ukrainian territory. This comes as Russian troops launched a major new military offensive in Luhansk, one of the two provinces that make up the Donbass region. Well, let's talk to the Associated Press correspondent, Kieran McQuillan in Lviv. Kieran, Poland's president didn't hold back when addressing Ukrainian lawmakers in Kyiv. Tell us more about what he had to say.
That's right, Jamie. He did not hold back, and he looked quite emotional, in fact, as he started to speak. He actually hesitated before he began his address, but when he did speak, he said this word. He said these words. He said, "I want to say it with all my might. The free world has the face of Ukraine today." And he got a standing ovation as he thanked the Ukrainian lawmakers for what he said was the honor of speaking in the place where the heart of a free and independent and democratic Ukraine beats. Now, for all of the Warsaw Pact countries, Poland is the one that has really stood by Ukraine throughout this crisis as this invasion has unfolded. It's taken in about 3.5 million Ukrainians as refugees. It's a country that is generally not very refugee friendly, but it has opened its arms with all of its might to take in these refugees and to look after them. Now, Poland is as well the cheerleader for Ukraine to join the European Union. That's part of the reason why President Duda was in Kiev today. Speaking to that, he said he would not rest until Ukraine was a member of the EU. There are some other EU members that are a little bit more reluctant to have Ukraine as a member, though those discussions will take place next month in Brussels. Moldova and Georgia are two other countries that have requested membership of the European Union. Now, Presidential Advisor Mikhail Poldykov struck a bit of a hardening of a note in a speech that he gave today, or overnight, in Kiev, talking about how much territory that Ukraine would cede. He said any concession to Russia is not a path to peace, but a war postponed for several years. Now, it's not very clear what territory that he was discussing. It's, Ukraine has mentioned this a couple of times about not ceding territory to Russia, whether it's the border at around about 2014, this informal line, as it were, after Ukraine's the invasion by Russia and its territorial incursion, or whether it's back to the borders of the Soviet era.
Kieran, let's talk about the military campaign underway here and now. Russia has launched a major new offensive in Luhansk. What more do we know?
Well, it all centres around the city of Severodonetsk. It's on the eastern bank of the Severodonetsk River. It's surrounded on three sides by Russian forces, and the Ukrainians said that overnight 4 different attacks were made, or 4 different incursions. Some of those were beaten back. Some of Ukraine's elite forces are on that eastern bank of the river. The Russians, are trying to cut off their resupply routes. They bombed a bridge between the east bank and the city of Lysychansk on the other side of that river. The Ukrainians say that they took out 9 tanks during this campaign today. Russia says it's deployed its Terminator 2 tank. This is a new build tank that they say can help them win the war. It looks very futuristic. Now, basically, what we possibly are seeing is that resupply now of Russian manpower coming around from Mariupol after the fall, helping the front lines there on the eastern bank and helping to reinforce Russian positions as they try and move forward in this new front that's opened up in this war.
Kieran, thanks for that. Kieran McQuillan from the Associated Press in Lviv. US President Joe Biden has landed in Japan for the second leg of his Asia tour. He's in the region to strengthen security alliances and increase economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific. China says that while it welcomes regional cooperation, creating geopolitical division should be avoided. Our correspondent Phoebe Amoroso reports now from Tokyo.
President Biden will meet with the emperor on Monday before sitting down for talks with Prime Minister Kishida. The two are expected to discuss ways to strengthen their response and deterrence capabilities and reaffirm their commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific region. Analysts say this is intended to counter concerns over China. Kishida is also set to announce a rise in Japan's defense spending. His ruling Liberal Democratic Party wants to raise Japan's defense budget beyond the traditional 1% cap of GDP to 2% or more. Also on the agenda, Biden is expected to announce the launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This aims to set standards on things like digital trade and clean energy. Securing supply chains is another major focus. But trade experts have criticized the limited scope of the framework. And while Japan says it will sign up, is still petitioning the Biden administration to rejoin the larger and more detailed Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US walked away from in 2017. China has denounced the strategy as creating division and inciting confrontation. It's accusing the US of trying to incite anti-China sentiment in the region. Phoebe Amoroso, CGTN, Tokyo.
It's the opening night of the 51st World Economic Forum meeting in Switzerland. After countless delays, the focus this year is on global security and getting battered economies back in shape post-pandemic. Our correspondent Ryan Thompson reports now from Davos.
These luscious green hillsides have replaced the snow that is the usual backdrop of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos. After nearly 2 years of multiple COVID delays, global minds in business, politics, and philanthropy are finally meeting face-to-face for a special spring session. The bar is high here in Davos. Previous meetings have ended with historic peace accords and major partnership announcements. 1998 saw Greece and Turkey narrowly escape war when they signed the Davos Declaration. This time around, the focus is on the war in Ukraine, surging global inflation, and fast-approaching climate emission deadlines.
We are faced, I think, with the most challenging geopolitical and geoeconomic situation for decades. We have a weak recovery that easily can turn into a recession. We have not that much movement on the green transition as we have hoped, and we are not out of the woods when it comes to COVID, the pandemic.
But though Davos may dream of changing the world for the better, some point out that words here don't always amount to concrete actions afterwards. Critics say for too long, the event's been guilty of whitewashing the issues while creating a massive carbon footprint locally.
I think the strength of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting here in Davos is that we have business and governments and civil society together. I know that during this meeting there will be many companies announcing that they will go net zero when it comes to CO2 emissions by 2050. We'll also have a gathering of the largest companies in the world here committing to green their supply chain. So the Apple, Amazons of the world say we will only buy products from you if you then reduce your CO2 footprint. I think this is very strong signals, and I think this is the strength of our annual meeting.
Regardless, the 2022 forum is convening at a turning point for history. For years, this crowd has embraced democracy and globalization. But since the last time delegates met, those ideas have come under threat. And the question is whether this meeting of the minds will be enough to renew that worldview. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Davos, Switzerland.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, named and shamed. The official report on Downing Street's illegal lockdown parties is just days away from being published.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN. Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. All change in Australia. The newly elected Labour leader says he'll shift the country in a new direction on climate policy. Ukraine says its government could not agree to any ceasefire with Russia that involves giving away any of its land. President Biden promises greater U.S. economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific region as he lands in Japan on the second leg of his Asia tour. And Belgium has become the first country to introduce a compulsory 21-day quarantine for monkeypox patients after reporting 4 cases of the disease in the last week. Let me take you back to our top story now. And Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, sustained weeks of constant heavy shelling. The metro stations were used to shelter residents during the bombardment, but now with the Russian military campaign focusing elsewhere, some locals have decided to return home. Our correspondent Zhao Yunfei followed one resident's last day in a shelter.
A makeshift home where residents have formed a community. Halina has been living here for more than 2 months. She says the conditions got better over time.
In the beginning, I was sleeping right there on the floor, and the people who used this folding bed have left for Poland.
Her daughter has also fled to Poland, trying to make a living. Halina decided to stay, but she says it's hard to recall the start of the conflict.
I stayed at home the first week. I thought Ukraine and Russia would reach an agreement and there wouldn't be a war, but it carried on, so I had to leave everything.
People have been living in fear of uncertainties. Volunteers provide mental health support to the displaced residents.
With the children, we are distracting them from trauma because they are feeling everything the adults feel, perhaps even more. When we came down, we could see the lights go out from their eyes.
For several weeks, one metro station can host as many as 500 people. But as the city resuming public transport, the shelter people will have to resettle. Halina has decided to go home. She packs a few bags. They are everything she has. As she bids farewell, she also wants to part with the suffering. This is Halina's first time above ground since she got resettled. Destroyed buildings and debris everywhere along the way. Back home, things are the same. This is where I live. This is my bed, she says. It was the scene as she left it when she escaped in March.
It's good. I won't be scared. They're not shelling anymore, are they?
Her neighbor updates her on events while she was away. The building kept shaking amid constant shelling while people hid in basements.
So far, everything is back to normal. I don't want those days to return. I just don't.
Halina says it's time to start a new life, one that she hopes is peaceful and quiet. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Kharkiv, northeastern Ukraine.
Well, it's known as Partygate, illegal gatherings held in the heart of British government during lockdowns that breach COVID rules. Now, the deadline has just passed for officials who are set to be mentioned to lodge any objection. The investigation, led by senior civil servant Sue Gray, is expected to be published in days. A separate police probe has already issued 126 fines, including one to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson has been following the story for us. Andrew, so the so-called Sue Gray report finally ready for publication?
And indeed, Jamie, we understand it has been ready for publication for some time. If it weren't for the Metropolitan Police decided to conduct their own investigations, then this may have been released a good deal earlier. It was 6 weeks ago when the initial reports came from the civil servant Sue Gray with such conclusions as failures of leadership and judgment at the heart of government, but very few other details. That gave way to the police report, which we understand 126 separate fines were issued by Metropolitan Police to people working within Downing Street and other government buildings over that period between the spring of 2020 and spring of 2021. Now Sue Gray's report is cleared to go. The deadline is passed. 5 o'clock today. She did allow, her team did allow anyone quoted or mentioned in the report to take up any issues they may have had with the content of that report. And there's also been something of a squabble of a meeting that is believed to have taken place between Sue Gray and the Prime Minister last month, which the opposition party, the Labour Party, is saying is unacceptable considering it was supposed to be a neutral report, suggesting perhaps that the Prime Minister has some influence over Sue Gray's proceedings. His ministers have denied that, and this morning the Education Secretary went around and did the morning rounds on the TV shows, making that quite clear.
What I do know is that the Prime Minister has never intervened in the investigation that Sue Gray conducted. He has always wanted her to go wherever the evidence takes her. I've worked with Sue Gray. I've known Sue Gray. I know she has the highest level of professionalism and her integrity is unquestionable.
Now, a lot has happened politically since this report was commissioned back in December last year. The war has broken out in Ukraine and is now absorbing an awful lot of political attention. There's cost of living crisis, the price of fuel, inflation, all these other issues that are battling for the headlines and battling for the concentration of government as well. However, there is still an enduring interest in the Prime Minister's conduct, and he has made it quite clear that once this report is published, he will go to the House of Commons and give his response to it.
Andrew, so when can we all expect the final version, and how much of it will we see?
It's strange. This saga has always been peppered with unclear deadlines. We're not quite sure why, but nonetheless, we expect sometime this week that the report should be published in full. Now, most people think it should be Tuesday, but there's no reason to believe it might not be Wednesday instead. A lot of the concern is about how much of the report will be made public. There are some, it's understood, 500 different photographs that were used in the research into conducting this report, and also, of course, hours of WhatsApp traffic and any amount of email chains as well. A lot of material can go into it. It could be a very hefty document indeed. Labour, the opposition, are saying they want to see absolutely all of it. They want it all to be published so that people can see it, but there's a concern that it may be a more reduced version that gets given out for public consumption. That's not quite clear. Either way, the Prime Minister will respond to that. People may think that things are over then for the Prime Minister, that this particular storm has passed. However, during his denials of any untoward activities going on during so-called Partygate, it was decided and voted by MPs that a committee called the Privileges Committee in the House of Commons should also conduct their investigation into the reliability of the Prime Minister's evidence. They also have yet to draw their conclusions and bring those back to the House for their consideration. So the saga does continue with another layer after this one.
Andrew, thanks for that. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. Floods in India's Assam state have killed at least 18 people and displaced more than 800,000. Rivers have burst their banks due to heavy pre-monsoon rain, submerging houses and destroying crops. Government relief agencies have been deployed, but people say they don't have enough rice to eat. More rain is forecast in the coming days. And an early heat wave has hit the United States East Coast. Near record temperatures have sent New Yorkers flocking to the beach. Temperatures soared to 31 degrees Celsius during the afternoon at Central Park. Sunday's expected to be another hot day before a drop to normal cool spring weather. The British Isles is home to around 10% of the world's puffins, but they're one of several seabird species threatened by climate change. The Zoological Society of London is calling for a better understanding of how to prevent a drastic decline in puffin and other seabirds. Our correspondent Kitty Logan reports.
This jagged stretch of North Sea coast, savaged by the elements, but a haven for seabirds flying in to breed. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds runs this reserve at Bempton Cliffs in northeast England. It helps monitor 500,000 seabirds, which flock here between April and October. A seabird spectacular of gannets, razorbills, kittiwakes and much more, precariously perched on rock ledges to nest. The cliffs also host around 3,000 puffins during the breeding season.
They'll be building up their burrows and preparing for nesting. We have had our first puffin egg spotted this year as well.
Tiny against these giant cliffs, puffins often shelter in cracks in the rocks. Known as the clowns of the sea with orange feet and bright beaks, they're on the UK's red list of endangered birds and quite hard to spot.
There's one that's nesting sort of just under the viewpoint on this side of the cliff.
But this is their ideal breeding ground.
The reason we have so many puffins here is just due to the sort of cliff-facing habitat. It's a wonderful sort of mix of sort of chalk cliff and it provides these really brilliant nesting holes where they can just automatically burrow in. They don't really need to do much.
But the North Sea temperature has recently risen by around 1 degree, changing the life cycle and availability of fish.
Sand eels are coming out out of hibernation earlier in the year and not at the peak time where puffins would need to be breeding and feeding their chicks. So with impacts of this, they're not getting as much food and nutrition for themselves and for their young. So that's having a big detrimental effect on their population.
The cliffs here are a hub of activity and full of the sound of seabirds. But at least half of the world's seabirds are in decline now. Puffins in particular are thought to be directly threatened by changes to our climate. Puffin numbers are holding up here, but not elsewhere in the UK. And there are stark warnings of a possible decline of up to 90% of the puffin population. Extreme weather linked to climate change is having a detrimental effect on breeding. The exact impact of climate change on seabirds is unclear. A recent study is calling for a more coordinated conservation response to these climate change threats and for urgent action to secure a safer future for these seabirds. Kitty Logan, CGTN at Bempton Cliffs.
The headlines again. All change in Australia. The newly elected Labour leader says he'll shift the country in a new direction on climate policy. Our other headlines, Ukraine says its government could not agree to any ceasefire with Russia that involves giving away any of its land. President Biden promises greater US economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific region as he lands in Japan on the second leg of his Asia tour. And Belgium has just become the first country to introduce a compulsory 21-day quarantine for monkeypox patients after reporting 4 cases of the disease in the last week. And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview. More news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's Razor. For now, from all of us on the programme, goodbye.